Welcome to Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes controversy discussion. I've been putting some time into the PlayStation 4 version of Ground Zeroes, and in doing so I've been working on some videos to upload at a later date. Two of those will include a review on the things I like and things I don't like about Ground Zeroes, but while doing these videos and researching, I've noticed throughout the gaming media outlets that there have been two issues which are consistently being raised, and while I was going to raise these as well, I came to the conclusion that these issues cannot really be explained and discussed in the space of a couple of minutes. Hence, I've created this video specifically to talk about them. Before I do, a fair warning, this video will contain spoilers for the story aspect of Ground Zeroes and also cover very mature themes which may offend. The two issues in question are the length versus the price of the game and the game's use of violence, specifically sexual violence. To begin with, we'll begin with the length versus the price of the game.
Mission info has been updated.
This is an infiltration mission. You've got to stay out of sight. Before you go any further, use your binoculars to recon the area.
In my country of Australia, the game upon release was sold for just under $50, which is close to half the average price of a newly released retail game. Because the length of a game is not entirely something that is set in stone or consistent between games, it is difficult to determine what amount of playtime you should be expecting per dollar you spend. Of course, the amount of time one expects from a game per dollar would really differ between individual. Also, the amount of time one achieves from a game would differ as well. I can't obviously speak for everyone, nor most people. I can only speak from my experience. I cleared my first run of the main section of the game in 55 minutes. I didn't find the game boring by any means, but it was unfulfilling. I felt hungry for more. I understand that some people would quit here from frustration, or even feel like they have been cheated, or either return or resell the game. Not me, however, as I do like to try and explore everything that a game can offer before I make a final judgment. You see, a game's clear time is not important to myself, and really neither is the playtime, but playtime still outweighs clear time when discussing this topic. In total, I've put in 8 hours, the majority of it has been enjoyable. Based on the less than usual retail price of a new game, a AAA game I stress, the game could be argued to be considered great value. The game has many additional features including collectibles, side missions and target runs, which are all there to persuade the player to complete multiple playthroughs, something which I never really actually understood. I still very much uphold the opinion that to make someone do multiple playthroughs of your game is very simply to make a great game. Collectibles, side missions, etc. are good, but if the core experience is weak and unfulfilling, then no amount of extra content can make you overlook that the main reason you bought the game was not enjoyable, and why would one go through that again, or even give any side option a chance. Though I don't entirely have an issue with the game's length, not enough to tag it with the favourable glorified demo tag, it does do some things which I definitely think hinders any opportunity it has to convince others of its value per dollar. To begin with, credits. When Big Boss finishes any mission, whether it be the main or side, credits roll. Most people signify credits with the end, and for the creators to include them after the player has only been played for most likely less than a couple of hours, I would really have to question this, particularly when they would have been most likely aware of players' hesitation before going into this game. I also think that only having one mission available from the beginning was a mistake. Having all missions available from the beginning I think could have given a greater impression of the game's overall amount of content. I understand that the game's creators would have chosen this way of presenting Ground Zeroes' mission structure to make sure every player plays the story mode, hence increasing excitement for the Phantom Pain. But even if everything was unlocked from the beginning, I feel extremely confident that most people would have tackled the main story mode first, or at least eventually anyways. Speaking of the Phantom Pain, having the trailer feature at the end of the mission really could leave a bad taste in the mouth. Yes, the trailer was great and I'm really looking forward to it, but it does nothing to help Ground Zeroes stand on its own as an individual game, unlike any of the other games in the series. And while I'm aware that the creators never originally meant for this to be a standalone game, and that it really should be perceived as a prologue, they really would have been better off as doing as much as possible to make Ground Zeroes get by on its own merits, which are pretty strong, but I'll go into that in a later date. Overall, I personally had no issue with the overall length of the game or its price, but with all the factors mentioned before, I don't necessarily think anyone would be wrong with questioning the game's value when it comes to the length versus its original asking price. The second issue, which has obviously caused a lot of attention, is the game's use of violence, with particular mention of sexual violence. To begin with, throughout this section I am going to be referring to arguments raised by several articles out there on the internet that analyse the sexual violence of Ground Zeroes. I'm not going to specifically name those articles, nor their authors or the publications. If you wish to read those articles yourself, you merely have to Google Ground Zeroes sexual violence and you will have a variety of articles to read. For those unaware, throughout the game there are several cassette tapes that Big Boss can find, with each one containing a new plot detail. The tape that caused the biggest stir is tape 4, which when played the player can hear essentially a torture scene of characters Paz and Chico by antagonist Skullface and also other soldiers under his command. The characters are tortured for information about their leaders and their relevant organizations, Zero, Cypher, Big Boss, and Mother Base. And while no specific details are mentioned, it is heavily implied that Paz is sexually assaulted by either Skullface or soldiers under his command, and Chico is also forced to engage in sexual acts with Paz, though it can be interpreted that Chico refuses by later giving Skullface the information he requires. Later though, it seems that Paz attempts to comfort Chico despite herself going through the harder ordeal of the two. She does this by either embracing him, kissing him, or sleeping with him. It isn't entirely clear, as there is no visual footage to go with the audio cassette tapes. I didn't get the feeling that they did sleep with each other, as Chico is too young, has bolts through his feet, Paz wouldn't have had the stamina, or the setting would not have felt romantic at all. Paz may have been worried about Chico, as what had happened would have been really upsetting for the young boy, so she sought to comfort him, which after what Paz went through gave me the impression that she was very much the strong character and is a strong character, both physically and mentally. This was my first interpretation. There are things that happen in later tapes, including Chico hurting Paz in an attempt to make her talk, obviously being forced by Skullface. I don't necessarily believe this was sexual in nature, as it doesn't make sense within the timeline of the tapes. But then again, there is nothing visual to go off, so I'm not entirely sure, and I think it's slightly left unanswered. The last tape has Skullface surgically placing 2 explosives into Paz, sort of to use her as a human bomb to take out Big Boss. One bomb is placed into Paz's stomach area, while the other isn't explicitly stated as to where it went, but Skullface says the line, "a place they will never look," and with the sound effects, it can either suggest they were inserted into Paz's vagina or rectum. It isn't entirely clear, and despite some publications stating the former as fact. Ground Zero's setting is Camp Omega. It is very obviously taking inspiration from another real-life prison camp which was owned and operated in a specific part of the world, which allowed the owners to ignore certain laws and conventions, further allowing them to gather information by the use of any means necessary, such as torture. To have the act of torture and sexual assault play out in the game actually fits within the context of the game's setting, though this isn't necessarily where all the controversy begins. Majority of it is not really at the existence of the violence in the game, but the way it is presented and how it is presented. The following are some of the arguments made by journalists in relation to the sexual violence in Ground Zeroes, and I'll just cap my thoughts on them afterwards. The most popular argument is that in Ground Zeroes, hearing sexual violence is a reward. The audio files containing the torture are located throughout the game on cassette tapes, which are not part of the main story. They can be classed as collectibles and are so in the game. Upon receiving collectibles in most video games, the player is rewarded with something. In Ground Zeroes, it is extra story, exposition, backstory if you will. I understand that people might not appreciate this, as it can be seen that they are being rewarded with a scene where sexual violence occurs. But video games are interactive in nature. As soon as you do any action in a game and receive anything, you are being rewarded. Unlike novels and movies, the player is expected to achieve. Any aspect of the story, items, or progression is a reward for playing the game. If the scene in question was not found in a collectible, but placed within the main story, you still would have had to have earned it. You would have played and progressed to be rewarded, so no matter where this scene was placed, it could be argued that the player is being rewarded. Therefore, it is difficult for myself to blame the game's creator on making a decision to place this scene in a collectible, as the alternative may have not been to include it at all. Granted, this may have pleased a lot of people, but creators still have the right to tell a story in a way they believe is beneficial to the overall experience, enjoyable or not. Was this a distasteful method? Potentially yes and no. Granted, it could have been worse, a lot worse, especially when we are dealing with an interactive and visual medium. But also, it maybe could have been done better. It maybe not has been so long, a bit more subtle, having a bit more warning on the detailed tapes, or even featuring in a more prevalent location within the story. But sometimes creators do things to engage an audience's reaction, even an uncomfortable reaction. I'm not saying that this scene was placed in as shock value. As I mentioned before, it does fit within the game's setting, but it is without a doubt a scene that is meant to stir certain emotions in the player, and even raise the discussion outside of the game. With all the articles out there, maybe this is the game achieving that goal, but I'm not sure, and only a few people would actually hold that answer. Another argument is that this serious theme is out of place within a series about giant robots, vampires, and Metal Gears. Despite having fantasy elements, it should not stop it from pressing real-world issues. It hasn't stopped such films like Avatar with its environmental message, nor District 9 with the message of health and the treatment of third-world countries. Granted, this is a much darker theme. Metal Gear throughout its series has had very mature themes, and I have never really thought of them to take them less serious due to the fact that they belong in a fantasy setting. In fact, sometimes due to the ridiculousness of what was happening, it may even heighten the impact of the message that was being raised, as one wasn't necessarily expecting it. It works within the Metal Gear gameplay as well. This was the story that the creators wanted to tell, and without the Metal Gear franchise, they may have not actually have had the chance to do it, as having something this heavy being the main focus of a new IP may not have gauged an audience for the game itself. Having it in an existing popular franchise does increase the number of people that you can spread your message to, even if on face value it can seem that it doesn't belong. Another argument is that it trivializes sexual violence. I'm not necessarily sure if this was the right word some authors meant, because it can be taken in two ways, or at least I took it in two ways. Does Ground Zeroes attempt to trivialize sexual violence by presenting it in a way that would make the player not care about the act as it happens to what they argue to be a lesser character? Or does it trivialize sexual violence by presenting it as something that can be added into a story without caring for the actual crime that can exist in the real world? I definitely don't think either was the purpose of the creators, as I feel very strongly that one doesn't necessarily listen to the tape and their opinion change on sexual violence. Before listening, I was very much of the opinion that sexual violence is one of the most horrid crimes an individual can commit. After listening to the tape, my opinion was 100% not altered in any way. I also don't believe that Paz was a throwaway character like many believe she was, and just there as a catalyst for Big Boss's revenge. The notion that Paz is a throwaway character or a fridge girl, essentially a simple character placed within a world to only act as a catalyst to the protagonist's revenge and the manipulation of the audience into both sympathizing with the hero and instantly hating the villain. Paz was a character very much fleshed out in Peace Walker, the previous game. Maybe it's Ground Zero's length that hinders it here in presenting her in more details about her, but the game is a sequel. By thinking that Paz was a throwaway character, I'm of the opinion that either the authors of the articles didn't necessarily play Peace Walker completely, or didn't feel the need to do the research once they learned that the character is subject to sexual violence. Also, a lot of articles have mentioned that Big Boss is apparently to enact revenge on Skullface due to his treatment specifically towards Paz. I'm not sure where they're getting this, as it's not stated anywhere that Big Boss feels any hatred towards Skullface due to his specific treatment of Paz, nor does he vow any revenge of any sort towards that treatment. Most authors seem to be jumping to conclusion about details about the Phantom Pain, and game they haven't played yet, to further their case. Yes, her treatment could definitely be a catalyst of revenge for Big Boss, but I don't necessarily think so, as it makes more sense for it to be a catalyst for Chico. And the revenge might actually not be pointed towards Skullface, but Big Boss himself, as he has failed to save Paz in time, and her being there was his doing in the first place. Also, the citing of revenge in the Phantom Pain's trailer probably has nothing to do with the treatment of Paz, but more the destruction of Mother Base. But I'm not entirely sure, as I myself have not played the Phantom Pain. There are other arguments out there which seem to be a stretch. One which I just wanted to point out now, which was that an author described the scene as being Oedipal. I think this is just looking too far into it. Oedipus was a man who killed his father unknowingly and then slept with his mother unknowingly. Later, when finding out, he pokes his eyes out. I don't necessarily see the correlation between the two. Just because a scene features a man, a woman, and a young boy and there's sex involved doesn't necessarily mean it's Oedipal in nature. In the end, I could never argue that hearing the tapes is an enjoyable experience, and I relate to anyone feeling uncomfortable listening to it. I do think they do add to the story of both the game and series as a whole, and that their inclusion, while not enjoyable, was a good decision by the game makers. Thank you very much for listening. If you feel the need to, you can leave a comment below, and I'll hopefully see you next time.